In this training, we will be discussing runaway and homeless youth, data elements, and HMIS. Runaway and homeless youth, or RHY data collection, is for RHY grantees, and it happens on a semi-annual basis, and it's categorized into different data set parts. One is universal data elements, otherwise known as UDEs, and program-specific data elements. RHY program-specific data elements allow FISB to capture critical information about employment, education status, critical issues that the youth is facing or that their family are facing, services and outcomes that are unique to unaccompanied youth. YHDP, or Youth Homelessness Demonstration Projects, also collect these data points. RHY have program components, and based upon those program components, you can serve and have additional project types associated with those components. The components are street outreach program, basic center programs for prevention, emergency shelter and host home shelter, transitional living programs, maternity group home, and the demonstration project. Project component types associated with those components are street outreach, homelessness prevention, emergency shelter, and transitional housing. Project entry dates are different for each program component type and project type. Basic center, emergency shelters, the entry date is when the project start date is the night the client first stayed in the shelter for the consecutive shelter period. So there will be a start and an exit. For basic center homelessness prevention, the project start date is the date the client first receives out of shelter services. For transitional living program, maternity group home, and demonstration projects with residential components, the project start date is the date of the first night of residence for the client. For street outreach projects, the project start date is the date of first contact with the client, regardless of how much information you receive from the client, and they should record all other separate contacts in addition to the project start date. For exit dates for basic center shelters, the exit date would represent the last day of continuous stay in the shelter before the client transfers to another residential project or living situation. For transitional living programs, maternity group home, and demonstration projects, the exit date would represent the last day of continuous stay in the project. For basic center homelessness prevention projects, the exit date should represent the last day of service that was provided to the client. And for street outreach projects, the exit date should be the date in which the street outreach worker is able to transfer the case to another youth provider caseworker, such as a shelter, transitional housing, permanent housing caseworker, or the youth no longer needs services provided by that street outreach project. Referral sources is a data element that's collected upon entry within your entry assessment. It indicates the person, place, or organization that referred the youth to your project for RHY services. You enter one referral source that most closely matches what the youth's answer is, and it's included in the head of households assessment. If an outreach project is selected, you must also put the number of times they were approached by an outreach prior to entering the project. RHY Basic Center status is a threefold data set. It enables the emergency shelter to record a youth that's not eligible for RHY programs and collect the information about that ineligible youth for reporting purposes. It also facilitates the local COC and HMIS to utilize data for a basic center program as part of their point in time count and other counts and measures through the COC. And it also identifies the number of runaway youth located within the COC that's served by RHY projects, and the RHY Basic Center program status occurs on the date when eligibility has been determined. There are some determinations and definitions around that determination. For number one, if you put out of range, it refers to a youth that's reached the age of 18 and thereby is ineligible for basic center program shelter services through the RHY regulations. Number two, if they're a ward of the state, it pertains to youth who are currently the responsibility of child welfare or foster care. If you identify that they're a ward of the criminal justice system, it defines a youth who's currently under court order to attend residential juvenile facility services. And there is an other selection for youth that are ineligible for other reasons not covered by the first three above. Sexual orientation is a data element collected by RHY and demonstration projects. The purpose is to identify sexual orientation of all heads of household and adults served in RHY projects. The options are heterosexual, gay, lesbian, bisexual, questioning / unsure, other, and client doesn't know, and client preferred not to answer. It is important that the measure be updated if the youth discloses information at a later time once a trusting relationship has been established. If a youth identifies as pansexual or asexual, there is an option for other, and then you would just describe the other in the box provided. Last grade completed is a data set that's collected. The purpose is to identify educational attainment of youth that are served in RHY projects, as well as to measure the change in educational status from project start to project exit for head of households and youth. You choose one response category describing the last date completed by the client at the time of project start, and then also at exit. These are the school status definitions for the drop-down options. Make sure you are aware of what the definitions are, because it will assist you in helping the youth identify their school status based upon these definitions. Employment status is also collected. Its purpose is to identify a client's employment status or need for employment services, as well as measure a change in employment status from project start to project exit for all heads of household and adults. You must enter the date the information was collected, which is called the information date, and when the information was relevant to that specific time. Employment status categories and definitions are listed right here. Please make sure you're aware of what these categories are and the definitions behind them, because it will help and assist the youth to identify their correct employment status at time of program start and program exit. Health status categories include general health, dental health, and mental health. It's used to identify the first step in which types of services, health services and other, a client may need during their time in your project. There is a scale from 1 to 5, where 1 is excellent and 5 is poor. Pregnancy status is also a data element that's used to determine the number of youth starting a project while pregnant, and help youth workers determine eligibility for benefits and needs for services. The expected due date is also a data set that's required. They're encouraged to record as much of the date as they know, default to January or the first day of the month for the current year for any person who has an expected due date that's not known. If a youth becomes pregnant during their project stay, please update the information and record the pregnancy. If a youth is formally a ward of child welfare or foster care, there is a data set that you must answer for that. It's a yes/no question and the number of years, and if it's less than 1 year, the total number of months. There's also a data set for youth that are formally a ward of the juvenile justice system. That's also collected at entry in HMIS. You would choose if they are, yes or no, the number of years, and if it's less than a year, the number of months. Within the entry assessment, there is also identified family critical issues. The purpose of this is used to identify services or needs that may be a factor in family reunification. You must choose appropriate responses for these categories to identify family issues as identified by staff and the young person for each head of household and adults. These issues should only be those of other family members from which the youth came from in the last household that they they were involved in. These are the different categories of family critical issues that you will identify: unemployment, mental health, physical disability, alcohol or substance abuse, insufficient income and support youth, and incarcerated parent. Please make sure you familiarize yourself with the definitions of these categories to help the youth answer these questions. Youth service connections or service transactions are a part of the data entry within HMIS. It enables projects to report the services that RHY projects provide to youth throughout the project time. Services which require repeat visits for the same kind of service are only required to enter the first service. So you don't necessarily need to have duplicate services throughout the time, just that there was a service of this type provided to the client. They're tracked through the service transactions in HMIS. Service connection charts. So these are the services that are tracked based upon the component type that's identified within your funding stream. RHY service connection categories, the definitions are listed in the next few slides. So please make sure you familiarize yourself with those services and the definitions of those services to help answer the questions and conduct the service transaction assessment within HMIS. To enter service transactions into HMIS, you would have to go to the service transaction portion of a client file and click Add a Service. You then must choose the start date and the end date for the service type, and then there will be the option for additional service notes if needed. And then there's a type of RHY service that must be answered to track for your RHY project. Commercial sexual exploitation and sex trafficking is a part of the data entry process for RHY projects. The purpose is to assess the extent of sexual exploitation of homeless youth within the COC. There's also labor exploitation and / trafficking questions as well that help identify youth that could be experiencing this type of exploitation and trafficking. There are questions like this within the entry assessment and the exit assessment. Make sure you answer these questions and ask these questions of the youth to help fill these data sets for your RHY project. There is a project completion status data set that's required within the exit assessment. The purpose is to identify whether a youth has completed the project or exited without completion. It's only collected for heads of households and adults within the project stay. And a youth who's exited the program because of their disappearance without advanced planning or notice should be no exit interview completed. Reasons why a youth was expelled or otherwise involuntarily discharged from the project are as follows. The definitions of those reasons are also accompanied with this slide. So make sure, again, you're familiar with the definitions of those reasons a youth would be expelled or discharged from your project to help answer those questions. There are questions around counseling and identified the type or amount of counseling the youth received by adults and for the head of households enrolled in your projects. Counseling per the RHY rule means the provision of guidance, support, referrals for services, including but not limited to health services, and advice to runaway or otherwise homeless youth and their families, as well as to youth and families when a young person is at risk of running away as appropriate. So there's a link to the CFR regulation as well. For each youth that received counseling, you must indicate the total number of sessions that they received between the project start and exit. Also indicate the number of sessions planned for the youth's treatment and service plan and whether a plan is in place to either start or continue counseling after project exit. The data set looks like this. Within HMIS, there is drop-down options that you can pull from. And if so, client received counseling, and if yes, they received counseling, identify the types of counseling received, number of sessions, total number of sessions planned, and that a plan is in place to start and continue counseling after exit. There's also a data set for safe and appropriate exits. The purpose of this is to determine the number of youth who exited to safe and appropriate destinations as determined by the youth themselves and determined by the project caseworker. So there's definitions and to these questions. So whether or not a youth exited to a private residence, another residential or independent living, and then safe appropriate exits are not exits to the following, and it lists these are the ones that are not considered to be safe and appropriate exits: the streets, locked correctional institutions and detention center, another residential program, an unknown or unspecified other living situation. Aftercare plans are also part of the RHY data element process. The purpose is to identify the extent of aftercare plans which were executed post-exit from the project, additional services provided beyond the period of residential stay that offer support and follow-up for the youth. From the date of project exit, there's a minimum of 3 months after the date of exit that aftercare services can be provided. If no aftercare was provided, enter the information date as the exit date and say no to aftercare was provided, and then enter as a follow-up review in HMIS. If you say yes, aftercare was provided, the information date should be the date of the first provision of aftercare. You must indicate the method via email or social media, telephone, in person, one-on-one contact, or in person where they participated in the group, and record each type of aftercare service, which should be made if a youth receives more than one type. And as always, please refer to your RHY HMIS manual for further questions around HMIS data entry.